Hello, you're watching the Great Canoe Bagel here, and today we have another Canada federal election forecast. Now, before I begin, I'd once to like to again shout out all my channel members. I really appreciate the support you guys give to the channel, and if you guys want to support the work I do here and make it a lot easier for me to continue doing what I'm doing, by all means, go in the link in the description below and press that join button. It might not seem like a lot, but every little bit really does help and make this more sustainable and easier. And otherwise, though, if you cannot afford to do that, I understand. It is trying times. Just do your regular YouTube things, like, share, subscribe, and comment below. But with that, let us begin. So, the big news in Canadian politics right now is that, well, Trudeau was away in Thailand negotiating free trade deals with Thailand and a couple other countries. There was apparently the musings of a caucus revolt. Now, these musings seem to have immediately collapsed as soon as Trudeau came back into the country, if they were indeed actually happening. Now, credible journalists were saying this, so I don't think it's necessarily that there wasn't musings, but I'm not sure if they were actually serious musings. But now, that does bring us to an interesting question here. If we look at the data here, the Liberals are continuing to slide. The Conservatives are continuing to rise. The NDP is going nowhere, and the Bloc is regaining in Quebec. The Fortress of Montreal here is getting relatively weak. Now you'll note those Kenai, the LaSalle I have here is marked in Liberal. I have it that way because I suspect right now, the same way I have St. Paul's here in red, I suspect both of those would flip back Liberal in a concerted proper election. One of my suspicions is one of the reasons those two ridings fell in the by-elections is a lot of Liberals were complacent and stayed home. But knowing that that is now a fightable riding, they're going to turn out higher numbers next time around. But I could be wrong in that assumption. By-elections are always really tricky on how to model. But across the board, the Liberals are not doing good. And we look at the modeling here. Since the 16th of September, the Liberals have lost 0.9 points nationally, heavily concentrated in Quebec, heavily concentrated in Ontario. That's not good. Now, they have lost ground in every part, a little bit in Atlantic, a little bit in the West, but losing 0.9 in Quebec and Ontario, or sorry, 1 point in Ontario, Quebec, and 0.9 in Ontario, is quite bad because there's actually seats there for them to lose. Losing 0.9 points in Saskatchewan doesn't matter anymore. They can't lose any more seats there. Losing 1.5 in Manitoba is pretty bad, but they only had 3 seats that they could lose. You start looking at, again, Ontario. That 0.9 points they lost converted into 6 seats they lost. In Quebec, that 1 point turned into 3 seats. And in Quebec itself, and there's plenty more seats in Ontario, there's too many to count, but there's at least 4 more very competitive seats that they could lose very easily in Quebec. And if they keep weakening, you might see Pontiac, you might see this riding here that I can't think of the name of, or other parts of Montreal itself become in play. And that could be quite bad. The Liberals are actually pretty close to losing every single riding that is not in a major urban area. Their only remaining ones is Moncton, the Beausejour, I think it's how I pronounce that. Comment below if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Bathurst, Pontiac, and Lake Champlain. Those are the 5 remaining ridings that are not part of a major urban area. Now, I know Brunswickers might say in the comments, Moncton's a major urban area. Maybe. You could argue maybe Moncton is a major urban area if St. John's is. I could see that maybe. So if we want to be generous there, then there's only 4 that are not in a major urban area, if we count Moncton as a major urban area. Though I'm dubious on if Moncton counts. It's a little small for that, still. So this is a pretty bad situation for the Liberals. There's really not much they can do from here. There's not much going on here. There's not making any progress. There's none of their actions are having any impact. None of their polls are moving in their way. None of their actions seem to be doing anything. None of their initiatives are doing anything. So it makes perfect sense why you're starting to see the caucus be uneasy. If you have a leader 9 years in the tooth, all your polling is just getting worse, or at best, the most favorable polls we're seeing right now are like these Ecos polls, which are dubious in and of themselves, but they're still showing a 16-point margin. You could say my poll is also somewhat favorable to the Liberals, but that's still not a good poll for the Liberals by any means. I'll bring it up here momentarily for those who have not seen it yet. Here we go. I have the Liberals down 16 points nationally as well in the data I've collected, and they're doing pretty bad in every region except Quebec. Though I think my Quebec sample is still anomalous. I have trouble polling Quebec because, shockingly, my English language channel and my English language networks do not acquire many francophones, and most Quebecers are francophones. Shocking. But that just implies that I'm overestimating the Liberals in this poll, which is not a good thing for the Liberals. You look at demographics across the board. None of them are doing well. There's just really no hope right now. Nothing is going well. So that leads to a very interesting question here. I spent much of the last year talking about what the Conservatives are doing, talking about what the NDP is doing. But what about the Liberals? Now, the Liberal government has been really focused on delivering things like pharmacare or dental care or the daycare program or raising the carbon tax. And none of these have moved the needle. And a lot of that really is because the Liberal government doesn't really know what it wants to do. Because, on one hand, a lot of these programs are pitched to try to alleviate the issues Canadians are facing. But then you look at things like the dental care program, and it's capped at $90,000 household income. Now, $90,000 might sound good to you, depending on your socioeconomic status. And in places like Nova Scotia, it's pretty good. Nova Scotia's median household income is $72,000. But much of Canada is above that. And especially once you factor in working age people, i.e. you remove retirees, you remove really young people who for some reason are living alone, probably university students might be in that case. And you get suddenly, oh wait, most people who have 2 working incomes, most 2-income households don't qualify. If you have 2 $50K a year jobs, you're by no means thriving. You don't qualify for dental care. Or equivalently, the pharmacare program is insulin, great if you're diabetic, and contraceptives, which is mostly worthless, other than to use as a wedge issue against conservatives or to placate a very niche part of the feminist base who really cares about stuff like that. But for the average person, being able to get birth control for free is not the difference between being able to buy a house or not, or putting groceries on the table or not. The people who are struggling with groceries, or the people who are struggling with buying a house, that's an irrelevant expense to it. Now, if you're diabetic, that might not be an irrelevant expense, but that's, again, a very niche percentage of the population. Thankfully, most people are not diabetic. And if we start having most people be diabetic, maybe we should put Ozempic as part of the dental care program, or the pharmacare program ASAP. And then you look at things like the daycare program. And the issues with the daycare program, ignoring all of the mechanical issues or sociological issues you might have with daycare as a principle, the actual program itself basically doesn't exist. There's not enough daycares anywhere in the country. There's not enough daycare capacity anywhere in the country. And there really isn't significant capacity going. I've been to town halls where people who run daycares, nonprofit, profit, and charity versions, and mom and pop daycares too. And across the board, they basically say the same thing. Like, we can't actually run the daycare at $10 a day. Like, the subsidy's not anywhere near enough money to actually make this work. And then you get into really silly things like that. Okay, if you can't actually run the daycare at $10 a day in your nonprofit, that means you have to subsidize it with donations, which is all fine and dandy, but there's only so much of that you have. And if the economy is doing poorly, your donations water up or dry up, and then it gets even harder. So this program's not scaling very well, and as another consequence of this, it kind of, again, reinforces people who are doing the least bad. The people most likely to make use of the daycare program are people with two-income households, and because of how it works out, it's people with two-income households who are doing well, because you have to be pretty well connected in a lot of places to actually get a daycare slot. I know, as a personal anecdote, my sister, where she lives in Nova Scotia, had a 5-year wait list if you put your child in at birth. Needless to say, a 5-year wait list to get to daycare is not very useful. So then we have, these are the flagship programs the Liberals have created in this last term, the last 4 years. The things that they're going into campaign on in 2024 or 2025. And none of them have really solved the mustard. They're not really fixing the problem. But at the same token, the Liberal polling isn't that bad yet. 26 is not good. But if they recoup even 3.7% from here, they're not doing bad. They'll regain a bunch of seats in Toronto, Ottawa. They'll recover the seats they've lost in Montreal, Quebec City, some in Vancouver, probably some in Winnipeg, some in Atlantic Canada. The Liberals will be in a lot better position. So the question then is, how do the Liberals get to 3.7? And that's where you get to the motivation for this alleged failed coup. There is a propositional question about the Liberal Party in 2024. Is it the Liberal Party, i.e. the party for liberals, ideologically liberals, center-left, generally people, social democrat types? The blue liberal who's like a little more fiscally conservative but still cares about social issue or left-wing social issues, stuff like that. The Quebec Federalist, the Atlantic Red Tory who doesn't like the Conservatives on the current instance. Is that still the party? Or is the Liberal Party of 2024 the Trudeau Party? And that's a very important propositional question. If the Liberal Party is the Trudeau Party, there is no saving it. If there is no identity, if there is no base beyond people who like Trudeau, then the moment they replace Trudeau with anyone else, the party is going to collapse. If the force that unites whatever's left of the Liberal base is just the person of Trudeau, it's no longer really a party but a cult of personality. And many pundits and many people have said this before, and as such, I don't know if that's actually the case, and we won't know until at some point in the future the Liberals do get rid of Trudeau. Be it they lose the 2025 election, or maybe he steps down, or maybe they do actually have a coup and he's forced out. But this propositional question is the big question here. And we don't know the answer. But for sake of the video and sake of argument, let's assume the Liberal Party structurally is not been hollowed out. It's not just the pantsuit of a personality cult. It's an actual, genuine party with livelihood and people in it who care beyond just Justin Trudeau. Now, I think that is potentially a bold assumption, considering the state the Liberal Party was in 2013 before he took over. But let's assume the unicorn moment wasn't a one-off. What do the Liberals need to gain from here? And this is a very tricky question. And I think, like many things, this is not going to be a question that any Liberal-aligned person will ever accept from me. And they'll just ignore this video. That's fine. Be what they wish. But the only option for the Liberals is they need to pick a leader that threads these coalitions quite well. So, if Trudeau's out, what does that mean? Well, the first thing is they need to pick a Quebecer. If they don't replace Trudeau with a Quebecer, their Quebec numbers will collapse. Despite how unpopular Trudeau is nationally, in Quebec itself, he's still relatively popular. That's why you can see here, he's doing okay in Quebec, 27%. That's not too bad. He only got 33% in the last election, so he's only lost a few points here. Whereas in lots of other regions, he's lost 6+ points. So he's not doing too bad in Quebec, and he has a lot of seats here. And there's quite a few seats he could retake. Or sorry, the Liberal Party could retake. This part of Quebec here, Quebec City, which is off the screen. Whatever, doesn't matter. The central part of Quebec City, there's a riding in Montreal itself. Some of the suburbs of Montreal could be in play, which are also off the screen. Does this make it on the screen? Aha, fixed it. I just had to zoom in more. Some of the suburbs, like right here, those are possibly in play. Sherbrooke, this guy here that I can't think of the name of, and parts of the ridings from the south here. You could probably look with a strong Liberal performance. They could probably pick up 8 seats in Quebec. So that's a good start. And they need to have a Quebecer, because the alternative is they lose seats. Because part of the reason the Liberals are still doing so well in Quebec is because Quebecers like the leader of the Liberal Party. And the Quebecers, unlike the rest of the country, well, actually this is not true. Most of the country, other than Ontario, will vote more for a party whose leader is from that area. It's true in Atlantic Canada, true in the West, true in BC. It's true in Quebec. So they replace Trudeau with a Torontonian. They're screwed. They're going to lose a lot of ground in Quebec, and they're going to gain really nothing because Ontarians don't care that much about who their leader is. At least historically, it hasn't been evident in polling or an election performance bonuses if the leader is from Ontario. Maybe that's different in the future, but the best we can guess from the past, that hasn't been an advantage. So Trudeau would have to be replaced by a Quebecer. And this Quebecer has to make a really bold decision. And the bold decision is directionally, what's the problem with the Liberal Party? Why are they failing? And there's two big options here. Option one is people don't like the fiscal policy of the Liberal Party. They don't like the carbon tax. They don't like the regulations. They don't like the immigration. Sorry, I confuse those things. They don't like the carbon tax. They don't like the regulations. They don't like the overspending. They don't like the anemic economy. That's option one. And option two is they don't like the social issues of the Liberal Party. They don't like the immigration. They don't like the constant talk about guns. They don't like the constant talk about abortion. They don't like the focus on things like, quote-unquote, LGBT issues and women's rights and other things. I say quote-unquote because those are very nebulous terms. Like that, what that means to different people is different things. And that's the big directional challenge. There is no capacity for the Liberals to elect a leader who will swing to the quote-unquote right on both of those issues. If they did that, they would be the Conservative Party. So that's just not a thing that can happen. Now, you could also potentially argue a third option. Maybe they need to swing to the left more. And you could say, okay, maybe the Liberals need to try to run a populist left-wing campaign. Now, there's a big hurdle with that, is that they're in government. They've been in power for 9 years. The Liberal Party has historically been in power most of the time the last 90 years. So trying to run a populist Liberal campaign from the PM's office would be very difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it'd be very difficult. And it would be challenging because a lot of the current Liberal base are these kind of centrist blue Liberal types. So if you pivot more to the left, it might be very difficult to win more NDPers than they lose blue Liberals. It's not impossible by any means, but it would be difficult. So that is the big question. What of those two, or maybe three, if you want to be generous, options do they pick? And what those different things do is they open up a big path. For example, if they pick to pivot to the center on social issues, and by that, it really doesn't necessarily mean that the Liberal Party has to undo gun bans or whatever, or pass abortion restrictions, which would be wild. But it more means they have to shelve those issues. Those aren't the things they talk about, though they would need to reduce immigration for this to work. And there they would pivot to trying to focus on economic issues. And this pitch is basically trying to go the Jack Layton path. And the Jack Layton path is you shelve and ignore social issues, at least from a political standpoint, from a leadership standpoint, from a campaign standpoint. And maybe you don't even do anything on them if you're in government, or at least anything substantial. And you focus on trying to do economic issues. So that would be, in the case of the Liberals right now, is they want to focus on economic issues that are affecting the youth. Now, one of the big issues the Liberals do have currently is their previous actions have tied a lot of their fiscal options pretty heavily. In the past, they've increased OAS payments. I can't remember the percentage, but it was a substantial increase to it. And already OAS was quite an expensive program. And they increased it, making it even more encompassing of a program. And I just want to note there for viewers who are not familiar, OAS is distinct from the Canadian Pension Program, which is something you have paid into. And it's distinct from the GIS, which is the Guaranteed Income Supplement, which is specifically a program targeted to support poor seniors. The OAS is just more of a general taxpayer-backed quote-unquote pension. No one paid into it per se. There was no savings deducted from your paycheck that was invested, like the CPP. This is just money that the feds are giving old people, 65 plus. And this contribution, the increase of OAS payments and the aging of our population is incredibly expensive. And not just on the perspective of all seniors. Just SMUB sections can be incredibly expensive. So the OAS does have a clawback to it. It's not just a flat payment to everyone above the age of 65. It is clawed back with income. But if you look at somebody who made, and I've done the math on this, a retired couple who made $113,000 from CPP and retirement savings, investments, they would get $20,000 in OAS supplement to their income. That's a lot of money for someone who's already making well above the median household income at a time when they presumably have paid off their mortgage. Because if you have enough investments to pay off that much money per year for the rest of your life, you've presumably paid off your mortgage. And other people who have more invested in doing the finance math than me have done the math on this, and roughly $9 billion of the federal deficit is going to rich seniors and through OAS payments. And this makes it very difficult for the Liberals to try to pivot to try to provide more fiscal support to young people, because there's not a lot of fiscal capacity left. Now, you'll see progressive types in Canada say, oh, the US is running a huge deficit, why can't we? Well, there's a categorical difference between different countries. Most of the world buys US treasury bonds so they can use US dollars as a foreign exchange currency. No one buys the Canadian dollar to use as a foreign exchange currency except to buy Canadian products. So if we flood the market with Canadian treasury bonds to raise to raise revenue, I guess we're technically raising debt. Anyways, you're just going to crater the Canadian dollar if you can find buyers for them. Which is going to be trickier because, again, there's no real reason to hold Canadian treasury bonds unless you want to buy things from Canada or you're a Canadian. Unlike the US treasury bonds, where everyone in the world who trades using the US dollar, which is most of the trade in the world, has an incentive to do that. So we have a lot less fiscal deficit capacity than the US does. And in a lot of regards, our country's already very indebted. It doesn't look as bad from headlines, but all the provinces are also incredibly indebted. Now, many people have said this before, that the provinces are actually more fiscally mismanaged than the federal government. And that's pretty much across parties. It doesn't matter which party's running the provinces. Most provinces are run pretty poorly. For the fiscal budget, that is. Balanced budgets, that is. So there's not a lot of fiscal room to do big things. So one option could be to cut OAS payments, which is very dangerous because a lot of the Liberal base is old people at this point. It's something like they have 22% among under 35s, 23% on 35 to 55s, and 29% on 55 plus. So, and if you break that 55 plus down for pollsters who have done both numbers, they do even better among 65 plus. So it is a very dangerous game to cut OAS payments, but unless they do that, they don't really have fiscal room to do too much, anything big. And that's really the problem, is they kind of need to do something big, or at least be able to promise something big and follow through with it. And this promise would have to be in their spring budget, which is probably going to start the election. I think the election's going to be, that budget is going to lead into the election, whatever it is. Which again, puts another huge wrinkle on trying to replace Trudeau. We only have probably 5 months. Which means this would have to happen this calendar year. And that's not a lot of time. But here's what I recommend. Let's continue. Maybe Trudeau could do these things too. So what you would do in this case is you probably have to cut OAS in some way, shape, or form. Maybe you raise retirement ages, some other way to gain fiscal room. And you have to use that money from that fiscal room to create a program that's going to actually help middle-class young people. Maybe you make dental care more expansive. Maybe you add more drugs to... But again, adding more drugs to primary doesn't do as much as you might think, or the dental care might not do as much as you think, because most young middle-class people have health insurance through work. You're really talking about a very small segment of the population that doesn't have health insurance through work. So it's a very tough program to do it that way. Now, cutting immigration itself would be an advantage in this scenario. But again, you see the trying to fiscally pivot scenario... Immigration's the other scenario. The fiscally pivot scenario, trying to stay true... No, I'm confusing myself. You have kind of immigration in this scenario. Sorry, I'm reading this wrong. So you have some room gained there because a lot of the immigrants coming in they're not even immigrants. A lot of the temporary foreign workers coming in or etc. cost us money on a fiscal level, but that's more complicated. I won't get into that. And having less demand on housing will be advantageous. But it's very difficult to pull out big programs that the Liberals could really offer here. I think really the best thing they could do would maybe be to plow a lot of money into healthcare. Maybe they could cut taxes, but that's not really a popular move from left-wingers, so that probably wouldn't go very well. Maybe they could plow it into the Canadian child benefit. That might be the most efficient thing they could do, just double that or something like that. But again, you don't have a ton of options right now from the Liberals because the fiscal room is very narrow. And at this point, if they were to dramatically increase the deficit, it would go over very, very badly. Okay, so let's shelve that scenario. Maybe there's just not enough fiscal room to lean into fiscal liberalism more. Maybe they try to lean more into fiscal conservatism and stay socially liberal. Now, I won't necessarily suggest anything on what they should do with social issues, left-wing perspective, because I don't actually really know what the feds could do on those issues, because a lot of them are actually provincial issues. So I'm not actually entirely sure what to do. But someone else might think of that. But you look at trying to be more fiscally conservative, what could they do? Again, you look at the face of the biggest head on the loom, or the biggest line item is, again, the OAS payments for rich seniors. And otherwise, there's not many good options that are like easy to see. Yes, I think you can save a ton of money if you went through the bureaucracy and you made sure to itemize and figure out which bureaucrats are actually useful, which ones are productive, and then fire the ones who aren't productive. Maybe disbanding government bureaucracies entirely that aren't very useful. Maybe you could consolidate like the tax code or the regulation code or whatever to make it easier to administer, reducing administration costs. You could do a bunch of things like that. But I don't think we can actually meaningfully see that in 5 months. If they did that at the start of a term, I think by the next election you would see the fruits of that. But in 5 months, I don't think you'd see any fruits. I don't think it would do anything because there's just not enough time for squeezing out efficiencies in the bureaucracy to do anything. The only big thing they could possibly do is just stop outsourcing work to people like McKinsey and do that all in-house, and that'd probably save a ton of money, and that'd probably be an easy line item to say. It's like, we cut subcontracting costs or outsourcing costs by whatever percentage, and this saved this many tax dollars, which we used to do this programs, or maybe cut taxes or something like that. I don't know. But that's challenging. It's a very challenging thing to do. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's challenging. And then our final third scenario I have outlined here, which is really leaning into economic populism, is again also a very hard thing to do because, again, they're constrained by this fiscal issue. If we were looking at a $10 billion deficit, they could do a whole lot here. But you're looking at a $40 billion deficit. You don't really have a ton of room. If you borrow too recklessly, it's going to precipitate a debt crisis, like we had in the 90s. It'll kill our credit rating, raise our debt borrowing costs, and then you'll have to start seeing someone come in like Craig Chen and just cut all the services again. And that's not something I think anyone left of center would want. So that would probably just kill the Liberal brand perpetually if they did this again. They borrowed too recklessly. So that's a very difficult position. And without the ability to spend money on things, it's challenging to really hit most of the left populist things you could say. The only remaining thing that they could really do, which would be a very big culture shift, especially given the context that Trudeau was out negotiating free trade agreements, is they would have to become economic populist on trade. That's really their only card in their hands. Start tearing up any in-progress free trade agreements, leave ones that are bad, and then start doing something like the Trump/Biden governments have been doing and institute more neo-protectionist policies, like the CHIPS Act or like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. If you do that, and then you do some things like maybe strengthen unions, penalize outsourcing, stuff like that, you could probably get a good pitch. And I think possibly this might be the most effective angle the Liberals could go at, but it requires the Liberals to basically abandon a core principle of the Liberal Party, which I don't think they have the stomach to do. This would require them to essentially say that free trade, at best, is not a no-brainer. And considering the amount of free trade deals the Trudeau government has signed, it'd be a very big and bold departure for the next person to come in and overturn all that work. Now, I'm very pessimistic about the options for the Liberal Party here replacing Trudeau, but I will say, even with all of that said, if the Liberal Party is still a real party and not just the husk of a party that Justin Trudeau is wearing, if they elect a good leader from Quebec who is charismatic, is personable, has new ideas, because it can't just be Trudeau 2.0. It has to be a different person. If they replace Trudeau with Trudeau 2.0, it'll be worse for them. They have to be someone who's categorically different, someone new. If they do that, and they thread this needle, which is very tight, I do see there is a possibility for them to get somewhere in the 30% range. Now, I don't think that's 30% range because they're getting a lot of supporters from the Conservatives back. Instead, I think that's 30% range because a lot of the people who are defecting to the NDP might come home. Right now, it's roughly 13% of the Liberal voters in 2021 are defecting NDP. Some quick math, roughly 33% times roughly 13% is... I can't do that in my head. What am I talking about? I'm too tired. Calculator, that's 4%. Now, I don't think they get necessarily that whole block back, and they might lose some voters in return to the NDP, or to some NDP Liberal switchers might leave them, or something like that, or maybe they'll lose some of the Conservatives. But you can see here, just reclaiming the part of the base defecting to the NDP, you're already looking at 3-4%. That could put them roughly where they were. Or, sorry, around 30%. It would crush the NDP. It'd lose, like, another half dozen seats, probably. But that doesn't really matter. In fact, actually, I think Trudeau would be very happy with this. I think one of the reasons Trudeau stayed on so long is he doesn't want the Liberal Party to be dead with him. He wants it to survive past him. So the only way that's going to happen is if he kills the NDP. Which Singh is not doing a very good job of preventing. But with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you next time with something new.